Hello and welcome to the final instalment of the On the Road videos, where I was riding around the countryside around Launceston and filming it and talking about things that interested me at the time. In this video I'll be spending a lot of time sitting at traffic lights, moving from McDonald's that's on the corner of Forster and Godrich Street in Launceston all the way through to my house at Trevellyn. I discovered when I was reviewing the footage that the camera or the card filled up just before I got home, so you'll see me getting towards the top of my street but not quite to my driveway, and there'll be a map at the end to show you where I went. As I said, we spend a lot of time sitting at traffic lights. I'm on a motor scooter, a Suzuki Bergman 650 AN executive scooter, and I could lane split or lane filter because that's legal in Tasmania, but I don't do that because first of all I'm in no hurry, and secondly because the scooter's fairly wide and scooters and motorcycles tend to be a little bit unstable at low speed. I'm a bit cautious about my own abilities in between lines of cars like that, so I'm quite happy to wait where I am and just proceed with the traffic. I could have also edited out all this section of just sitting in the traffic lights, but if I'd have done that, there would be practically no video. So I've left it all in, and it gives me the opportunity to talk about what it is that I wanted to talk about today. In the last video I was talking about standards, and I concluded that section by comparing two films, Gone with the Wind, that was made in 1939 and almost didn't make it to the cinemas because of one offensive word at the end of the film, with The Wolf of Wall Street, which was made in 2013 and contained a word that was infinitely more offensive in 1939 than the word uttered in Gone with the Wind. It contained that word 750 times or more, allegedly. Both films were considered to be great films, and both directors are considered to be great directors. But my point is that standards change. When I was a child, one of the popular shows on TV was a show called The Honeymooners, starring Jackie Gleason. And Jackie Gleason had a catchphrase which was, "To the moon, Alice," and it always implied that he was going to punch his wife to the moon. And so by today's standards that show would never be made because it seemed to condone or promote or at least accept what we now call family violence. To my knowledge, Jackie Gleason never hit his wife in the show and never hit his wife in real life, but the very fact that it hinted at family violence would mean that show would not be made now. We watched it because it was on, because that was the standard. It became almost the formula for sitcoms, with a hapless sort of chump of a bloke who is in a menial sort of job and was always coming up with grand schemes that inevitably went wrong, and his wife, long-suffering wife, saving him from his own stupidity in some cases. And if you think about the Honeymooners, led us to the Flintstones, which led us to the Jetsons, which led us to the Simpsons, and lots of sitcoms are based around a similar theme of some working stiff, hapless Joe of a bloke who tries to do the right thing but's really not able to do the right thing because he doesn't know what it is. He just tries to do it, comes up with all these nefarious, silly schemes to get rich or to solve problems or whatever that inevitably go wrong, but his wife tends to get him out of trouble at the finish, and at the end of each episode there's a family hug and a bit of a chuckle and everybody learns something. Again, when I was a kid, there was a show on TV about a bloke who was an architect who kept a horse in a stable next to his architecture studio, and the horse talked. Now, we watched that show again because it was on, because that was the standard, and we thought it was funny and clever. Nowadays, we probably wouldn't make such a show, although there have been plenty of shows about animals that could allegedly talk or communicate with people. Skippy the kangaroo, Flipper, my friend Flicker, Lassie, and so on. But we watched that show because it was on. And we often think about shows from any point in history and say, well, why did we watch those? And we watched them because they were on and because that was the standard of show that was made. Again, when I was young, there were a plethora of shows about the Old West. Gunsmoke, Bonanza, Bat Masterson, Maverick, Shotgun Slade, The Rifleman, The Lawman, Wyatt Earp, Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie and so on. And all of these shows involve some sort of gun violence, where the hero, Wyatt Earp or somebody else, saved the town from the bad guys, and built on that mythology that was created by Westerns in the 1940s and 50s of Western towns where there were shootouts in the street and so on. I began this talk in the last video by referring to a Western that someone had suggested that people watch and put aside these modern sensibilities about sexism and misogyny and so on, and just watch the movie for what it was. And as I say, it got me thinking that if we were to look at many things that are around today, or many things that are around that happened in the past, and judge them by today's standards, we would say that should never have been done, and because it was done, it was such a terrible thing, we shouldn't watch it. And we would put that thing away in a vault somewhere and hide it away, or destroy all the copies of it, and no one would ever get to see it. Rather than say, well, okay, there are things about this particular film or television show or whatever it is that by today's standards make us feel a bit uncomfortable, but let's judge it by the social context in which it was made, the historical context, the political context, and all the other things that were going on in society at the time this program was made, or this film was made, or whatever, and learn something from it, and say that, well, we wouldn't talk about people of colour that way any longer. We wouldn't stereotype Asian people in a particular way that might have been stereotyped in a film in an earlier period and so on. Because if we just say, well, that thing, that movie, that TV show, whatever it is, doesn't measure up by today's standards, we will never learn. We will never appreciate our history, whether it be the film history or anything else, and we'll only say, well, things that are made now that don't make me feel uncomfortable are the only things that should be allowed. So it got me thinking a little bit about the idea of, we think now that we have a pretty good formula for how to make a TV show, or how to make successful TV shows and movies. And we say that TV shows and movies should be full of diversity. They should feature people of different cultures. And that sounds reasonable because society is made up of people of different cultures. We're not a white, monocultured country any longer. We are a world of many cultures. So we should see many cultures on TV. We also should see people of many religions, because there are many religions and all of them are legitimate. We should see people of diverse gender and sexual orientations. We should perhaps see people of a range of neurological diversities as well. And that all sounds fair and reasonable, because society is, after all, made up that way. My problem with that approach sometimes is that we tend to do a tick-the-box exercise and say, well, we've got to have a person of colour, we've got to have a queer person, we've got to have an autistic or person on the autistic spectrum somewhere, we've got to have a person in a wheelchair to show people of different abilities in our show. Now, whether that character is needed or not to progress the story, or whether that character is going to do something in the story that is meaningful and part of the story or not, as long as we've got that character, we've catered to all the different diverse groups, and nobody can say they've been left out or they've been discriminated against. After all, remember that the idea of entertainment, film, television, is to tell stories. And good films and good television tell good stories, and they tell them well. What makes a good story is, or what makes good films and good television, I guess, is the story to start off with, the writing. So whether it's chosen from somebody else's source, like a book that somebody's written, or the writers themselves sit down and come up with the show, it is the writing that starts the process of making a good story. A director comes along and takes that story and turns it into something that is interesting and worthwhile watching. If it's taken from a book, the director knows that there are some things in the book that they have to take out because they're interesting to read in the book, but they're not going to translate into something interesting in the screen or on the screen, and the audience is going to be bored. Or that the person making the film is taking a book that's 300, 400, 500, 600 pages sometimes and saying, I've only got an hour and a half or 2 hours to tell this story, so I've just got to take out some things because they won't resonate with the audience that's come to watch. The other thing that makes the film, of course, is the actors. And let's remember that actors are there pretending to be somebody they're not. And the most successful actor or actors, whether they're male or female, I'm using the word generically here, I'm not talking about male actors only, I'm talking about actors. The most successful actors are the ones who convince us to suspend our disbelief and believe that they, that is the actor, are the person they are playing. I think the actors, they inhabited the character so well that they've become the character. But when the camera stops, they revert to being whoever they are. Nobody thinks that Dustin Hoffman really was Rain Man. Nobody thinks that Russell Crowe really was John Nash. Nobody seriously thinks that Harrison Ford is Indiana Jones. We know that those actors do things to put themselves into character and become the character. And as Russell Crowe once said, I owe the audience something between action and stop, or action and cut, and after that I don't owe them anything. I've done my job, I've become the character, I've played the part, and now I'm Russell Crowe and I want to go to my farm and go on with my life or whatever it is. And one of the things that we need to understand is that an actor is a person doing a job, being paid to do the job. And I recall Tom Selleck once saying he was lucky. He felt grateful that someone had offered him work when he was in Friends, because he was just happy that someone had offered him a job and that he was working rather than sitting at home doing nothing and waiting for someone to call him. So there's a notion in some circles that if you haven't lived my experience, you can't play me. And that's usually usually said in regard to people or actors who are employed to play, I'm not sure what the right words are, gender diverse or sexually diverse people. And the argument seems to be, if you're not gay, you can't play a gay person. If you're not trans, you can't play a trans person, and so on. And I would counter that with a couple of points to consider. Number one is, Daniel Day-Lewis couldn't have lived the experience of Abraham Lincoln, for example, and yet he won an Academy Award for his performance as Lincoln. Gary Oldman could not have lived the experience of Winston Churchill during World War II, and yet he gave a stirring performance as Winston Churchill in a film that was made a couple of years ago. Going further back than that, John Travolta could not have lived the experience of Bill Clinton on the campaign trail, and yet everybody believed he did a marvellous job in that film Primary Colours. So the job of actors is to act and to make us to believe that they are the character that they're acting or they're pretending to be. Ricky Gervais once said, for example, that you don't get a person in a wheelchair to play a person in a wheelchair because then they're just playing themselves. You get an actor because the actor has to learn what it's like to be in the wheelchair. The actor has to learn about the person they're portraying. So Eddie Redmayne, I think it was, playing Stephen Hawking, has to learn about Stephen Hawking and what it's like to be living with that disease and what it's like to be spending your life in a wheelchair, talking with a monitor and things like that. And that's the skill of acting, to make us believe that you've become the character that you're playing. Another argument that's often put is that if I don't see myself on television or in films, it's like I don't exist. And this is often again said in relation to people who are gender or sexually diverse. Now, I don't mean this in any way to be disparaging of those people or diminishing their experiences or saying their experiences of life are not real, because they certainly are. I'm not in any way suggesting that if a person identifies as a certain gender or sexual orientation, that it's not a valid thing. It is. You are what you are. You are what you think you are what you identify as, and you are what you believe you are. But you're not validated by people performing in pieces of fiction. Let's remember that TV, movies, even if they're based on real people and based on actual events, are one person's interpretation of those events. In many cases, they're fiction. Somebody sat down and made up a story and made up a bunch of characters. But even if, as I said, they're real characters, they're one person's take on those events. And who's to say that particular take is the right take? But in your everybody in their everyday life as a real person who goes to school or university or some other training institution or goes to work or goes out into the world every day and mingles with other people, comes across other people who are like them. Not everybody who is like them wears a badge that says, I'm one of you. We don't always know that the people walking next to us on the street, whether they're gay or they're not gay. We don't know if the person crossing the road next to us or on the other side of the road from us is neurologically diverse or whatever. Obviously, we can tell if it's a person of colour, and we can tell with certain people of certain religions because they wear turbans and other symbols of their religion. But in many cases, we don't necessarily know that the person is whatever it is they're identifying as, and but they're out there in the world. They're there every day. And so when you go to your job, when you go to your school, when you go to your university, when you go to get your groceries or whatever, you're validated by the fact that, first of all, you exist. You are a real person and you exist. You're further validated by the fact that there are other people like you in the real world. Not in the world that's on television, not in the world that's in movies, not in the world of fiction, but in the real world where you live, there are other people like you. I get it that people like to see stories told about themselves, but those stories, again, as I've said, are pieces of fiction. I'm a 69-year-old, soon-to-be 69-year-old white male, so I guess I'm probably one of the most privileged people on the planet. Stories about people my age tend to be about either guys who are world has passed them by and they're grumpy old blokes, and people might say, well, that's exactly what you sound like in this video, or they're people who are on the cusp of dementia in the old folks' home and into the decline of their golden or sunset years. Now, I don't think I'm either of those things at the moment. I don't think I'm a particularly grumpy old man. There may be some things in the world that have passed me by, and that's fair enough, but I don't think I'm a particularly grumpy old man. And I'm certainly not ready for the old folks' home, and as far as I know, dementia hasn't crept up on me yet. I'm an active person. I do a lot of thinking. I do a lot of making videos like this. I do a lot of running and so on. I'm a physically active person. I don't want to see myself portrayed as someone who's got one foot in the grave and the other foot in the old folks' home. But I'm validated by the fact that I exist. There are other people out there like me. Some are in better states of health than me. Some are in worse states of health than me. But I don't need television to tell me that I'm a real person, or or to be validated by directors of movies or TV shows or whatever. Thinking about these standards that we say, well, this is how we should make a television show at the moment. This is what makes good television. We think about some shows that we watch now or have watched in the not too distant past that are really, really popular. And if we judge them by today's standards, we'd probably realise they're pretty awful shows as well. I'm thinking, for example, of a show about 6 people, none of whom ever went to work or had a job or had any of the concerns that you as a person might have